In the shadow of Florence's towering cathedral, where morning light filtered through ancient stone corridors, a revelation emerged that would challenge 5 centuries of moral certainty. Niccolò Machiavelli, hunched over his desk in the dim candlelight of his study, was not the cynical advocate for ruthless power that history would paint him to be. Instead, he was a man tormented by a profound understanding of virtue's most dangerous secret, that goodness itself could become the architect of its own destruction. The year was 1513, and Machiavelli found himself in exile, stripped of his position in the Florentine Republic, watching from afar as the very principles he had spent his life defending crumbled under the weight of their own nobility. It was in this crucible of political defeat and personal humiliation that he began to perceive what others had missed: the astonishing toll that virtue exacted from those who dared to embody it completely. Consider the case of Pier Soderini, the perpetual gonfalonier of Florence, a man whose commitment to justice and republican ideals was absolute. Soderini governed with unwavering moral principles, refusing to compromise his values even when pragmatism demanded flexibility. He believed, with touching naivety, that virtue would triumph simply by being virtue, that goodness possessed an inherent power that would overcome the machinations of lesser men. When the Spanish armies approached Florence's gates and Pope Julius II demanded Soderini's removal, the gonfalonier faced a choice that would illuminate the cruel mathematics of moral leadership: compromise his principles to save his city, or maintain his integrity and watch everything he had built collapse. Soderini chose virtue. He refused to engage in the deceptions and strategic manipulations that might have preserved his government. He would not levy extraordinary taxes to fund a proper military, believing such measures violated the people's trust. He would not form alliances with unsavory partners, even when isolation meant certain defeat. He would not remove potential rivals or silence critics, considering such actions beneath a true republican leader. In maintaining his moral purity, Soderini ensured his own destruction and, with it, the destruction of the very republic he sought to protect. This was Machiavelli's first glimpse into the paradox that would consume his thoughts for the remainder of his life. Virtue, pursued without understanding of its own vulnerabilities, becomes a form of sophisticated suicide. The good man, in his determination to remain untainted by the world's corruption, renders himself incapable of protecting the very values he holds dear. He becomes, in Machiavelli's brutal assessment, complicit in evil's triumph through his refusal to engage with evil's methods. But the toll of being good extends far beyond political failure. Machiavelli observed that virtue exacts its price in the deepest chambers of the human soul, transforming its practitioners in ways they neither expect nor understand. The truly good person must bear witness to injustice while maintaining faith in justice, must observe cruelty while preserving compassion, must endure betrayal while remaining trustworthy. This constant exposure to the world's darkness, combined with the obligation to respond with light, creates a psychological burden of staggering proportions. The virtuous leader lives in perpetual tension between competing moral demands. Every decision becomes a choice between different forms of good, different obligations to different constituencies. Should a ruler prioritize the immediate welfare of his subjects or their long-term security? Should he honor treaties that no longer serve his people's interests? Should he tell truths that might cause panic or maintain lies that preserve order? These are not choices between good and evil, but between different expressions of virtue that cannot coexist. Machiavelli watched virtuous men struggle with these impossible choices and witnessed how the struggle changed them. Some, like Soderini, maintained their purity by avoiding the hard choices altogether, effectively abdicating their responsibility to govern. Others made the necessary compromises but were consumed by guilt, their virtue poisoned by the knowledge of their own moral failures. Still others learned to rationalize their compromises, gradually losing touch with the very principles that had once guided them. The most tragic figures were those who understood the full scope of their dilemma, leaders who knew that virtue required them to act against virtue, that protecting good demanded embracing aspects of evil. These men lived in a state of perpetual moral anguish, their souls split between what they were and what their duties demanded they become. They paid the ultimate price for their goodness, the loss of their ability to see themselves as good. Yet Machiavelli's observations revealed an even deeper layer to virtue's toll. The good man, precisely because of his goodness, becomes a target for those who would exploit his nobility. His honesty makes him predictable, his compassion makes him manipulable, his sense of honor makes him vulnerable to those who feel no such constraints. In a world where some men recognize no moral boundaries, virtue becomes not a strength but a weakness, not a protection but an invitation to predation. The history of Florence was littered with the corpses of good men who had failed to understand this fundamental asymmetry. They approached politics as if it were governed by the same moral laws that governed personal relationships, assuming that virtue would be recognized and rewarded by virtue. Instead, they discovered that their goodness made them easy prey for those who understood that power, not morality, determined political outcomes. This realization forced Machiavelli to confront a disturbing truth, that virtue, as traditionally understood, was poorly adapted to the world in which it found itself. Like a delicate flower planted in rocky soil, it might possess inherent beauty and value, but it would struggle to survive, let alone flourish. The good man was not just disadvantaged in political competition, he was actively handicapped by the very qualities that made him good. The psychological toll of this recognition was immense. To understand that virtue carried within itself the seeds of its own defeat was to face a universe that seemed fundamentally hostile to moral behavior. It suggested that the cosmos itself might be structured in such a way that goodness was not just difficult but actively punished, while evil not only persisted but prospered. Yet Machiavelli refused to accept this dark vision as the final word. Even as he catalogued virtue's vulnerabilities and documented its failures, he sensed that there might be another way forward, a path that neither abandoned virtue nor succumbed to its traditional weaknesses. The answer lay not in rejecting goodness but in understanding its true nature and its proper application in an imperfect world. This understanding would require abandoning comfortable illusions about virtue's simplicity and confronting the complex, often contradictory demands of moral action in political life. The toll of being good, Machiavelli realized, was not merely the price paid by individuals who chose virtue over expedience. It was the cost extracted by reality itself from those who refused to acknowledge its harsh demands. And, yet, within this recognition lay the possibility of a different kind of virtue, one that was neither naive nor cynical, neither pure nor corrupt, but something entirely new, a virtue that understood itself and its world well enough to survive and even prevail. Part 2, The Paradox of Moral Strength. The autumn of 1502 found Machiavelli traveling through the Romagna as an envoy of the Florentine Republic, observing firsthand the methods of Cesare Borgia, a man who would become central to his understanding of power's relationship with virtue. What Machiavelli witnessed in those crucial months would shatter his preconceptions about the nature of effective leadership and force him to confront the deepest paradox of political morality, that sometimes, being truly good required appearing to be bad. Borgia's treatment of his enemies revealed a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between cruelty and mercy that transcended conventional moral categories. When he conquered Cesena, Borgia faced the same choice that had paralyzed so many virtuous leaders: how to establish order in a region torn apart by factional violence and corruption. The traditional virtuous approach would have been to implement justice gradually, to win over opponents through patience and clemency, to demonstrate through consistent good behavior that the new regime represented an improvement over the old. Instead, Borgia appointed Ramiro de Orco, a man of notorious cruelty, as his lieutenant. De Orco's methods were brutal and decisive. He crushed opposition ruthlessly, executed corrupt officials publicly, and imposed order through fear. The region, which had known nothing but chaos and suffering under its previous rulers, found itself suddenly at peace. But then, just as the pacification was complete, Borgia made his most shocking move. He had de Orco himself executed and his body displayed in the public square, cut in half with a wooden block and a bloody knife beside it. This act revealed the hidden geometry of moral action that conventional virtue could not perceive. Borgia had used de Orco's cruelty to achieve what kindness could not: the rapid establishment of peace and security for thousands of people. But he also understood that cruelty, once unleashed, becomes a poison that contaminates everything it touches. By executing de Orco, Borgia demonstrated that the cruelty had been a tool, not a character trait, and that he himself remained capable of justice. The people of the Romagna, who had initially feared Borgia, came to love him, understanding that his apparent ruthlessness had been employed in service of their welfare. This was Machiavelli's introduction to what he would later term the paradox of moral strength, that sometimes, the highest form of virtue required the temporary embrace of vice. The truly good leader, faced with evil that could only be defeated through evil means, must be willing to soil his hands to preserve the purity of his ultimate ends. This was not moral relativism or cynical pragmatism, but a sophisticated understanding of virtue's operational requirements in a fallen world. The psychological toll of this realization on those capable of such moral complexity was enormous. Unlike the simple villain, who felt no conflict between his methods and his nature, or the simple saint, who avoided conflict by avoiding difficult choices, the virtuous leader who understood Borgia's lesson lived in a state of perpetual tension. He must maintain within himself both the capacity for mercy and the capacity for cruelty, both the impulse toward trust and the necessity of suspicion, both the desire for transparency and the requirement for deception. This internal division created a unique form of suffering that Machiavelli came to see as the essential burden of moral leadership. The leader who truly understood virtue's demands could never be at peace with himself, because he could never fully embody the simplicity that peace required. He must be, in Machiavelli's famous formulation, both lion and fox, capable of fierce direct action when strength was required, but also capable of cunning and direction when strength alone would fail. Consider the fate of Julius II, the warrior pope who understood this paradox instinctively. Julius wielded both spiritual and temporal power with equal ferocity, leading armies into battle while maintaining his role as spiritual father of Christendom. His contemporaries were scandalized by the apparent contradiction between his priestly vows and his military campaigns, but Julius understood something they did not, that the Church's spiritual mission could only be protected through worldly power, and that worldly power could only be maintained through worldly methods. The toll on Julius was visible to those who knew him well. He aged rapidly during his pontificate, his face bearing the marks of constant internal struggle. He was neither the peaceful priest his office seemed to demand nor the simple warrior his methods suggested, but something more complex and more costly, a man who had accepted the burden of moral contradiction in service of a higher purpose. His prayers were those of a man who knew himself to be simultaneously saint and sinner, protector and destroyer, servant of God and wielder of earthly power. This psychological complexity extended beyond individual leaders to entire societies that attempted to embody virtue in their institutions. The Venetian Republic, which Machiavelli studied with fascination, had created a governmental system that seemed to embody the highest ideals of civic virtue. Power was distributed among multiple institutions, decisions were made through careful deliberation, and individual ambition was subordinated to collective good. Yet this very virtue created vulnerabilities that more straightforward tyrannies avoided. Venice's commitment to deliberative decision-making meant that it responded slowly to crises, often arriving at correct decisions too late to be effective. Its complex constitutional arrangements created opportunities for paralysis when different institutions disagreed on proper courses of action. Its emphasis on collective responsibility made it difficult to identify and punish individual failures, allowing incompetence and corruption to persist longer than they would under more autocratic systems. Most significantly, Venice's virtue made it reluctant to employ the ruthless methods that its competitors used without hesitation. When faced with threats that could only be countered through deception, bribery, or assassination, Venice often found itself constrained by its own principles. Its enemies, recognizing these constraints, learned to exploit them systematically, knowing that Venice would not respond to certain provocations because doing so would require abandoning its foundational commitments. The result was a republic that was simultaneously more virtuous and more vulnerable than its neighbors, capable of inspiring admiration but not always capable of protecting itself. The Venetians paid the toll of being good in the form of constant anxiety about their survival, knowing that their virtue made them targets for less scrupulous powers who envied their success and understood their weaknesses. Machiavelli observed that this dynamic operated not just among states but within the souls of individual citizens who took their civic duties seriously. The good Venetian citizen lived with the knowledge that his personal virtue contributed to his society's vulnerability, that his own moral development made his community less able to compete with societies that had chosen different paths. This created a unique form of moral vertigo, the recognition that individual goodness might collectively produce bad outcomes. The most profound aspect of this paradox was its self-reinforcing nature. Once a society or individual recognized that virtue created vulnerability, the recognition itself became a source of further moral complexity. Should the good person abandon goodness to protect goodness? Should the virtuous society compromise its principles to preserve its ability to practice those principles? These questions had no simple answers, but their very existence created additional psychological burdens for those committed to moral behavior. Some individuals and societies responded to this paradox by retreating into moral puritanism, insisting that virtue must be preserved regardless of consequences. Others swung in the opposite direction, using the complexity of moral action as an excuse to abandon moral considerations altogether. But, the most interesting cases, from Machiavelli's perspective, were those who attempted to navigate between these extremes, maintaining their commitment to virtue while acknowledging its operational complexities. These were the figures who fascinated Machiavelli most, leaders who could be simultaneously virtuous and effective, who understood that true virtue sometimes required apparent vice, who accepted the psychological toll of moral contradiction as the price of moral leadership. They were neither saints nor sinners but something more complex, individuals who had learned to carry the full weight of moral responsibility in an imperfect world. The hidden wisdom in Machiavelli's analysis was not that virtue was impossible or undesirable, but that it was far more demanding than most people understood. True virtue required not just good intentions but sophisticated understanding, not just moral purity but strategic thinking, not just individual goodness but systemic awareness. It demanded a level of psychological integration that few individuals could achieve and an acceptance of moral complexity that most societies found unbearable. Part 3: The redemption of necessary evil in the final years of his life. As Machiavelli walked among the olive groves of his family estate outside Florence, he carried within himself a burden that had taken decades to fully comprehend, the recognition that his insights into virtue's vulnerabilities were not merely intellectual observations but practical wisdom that demanded action. The man who had been dismissed as an advocate for cynical realpolitik had actually discovered something far more profound and disturbing, that the preservation of good in an imperfect world sometimes required the strategic employment of evil, and that this employment could itself be a form of virtue if properly understood and carefully bounded. The final piece of Machiavelli's hidden wisdom emerged from his study of those rare individuals who had successfully navigated the treacherous waters between moral purity and practical effectiveness. These were not the simple heroes of popular imagination, who triumphed through unwavering adherence to principle, nor the simple villains, who succeeded through the complete abandonment of principle. Instead, they were figures of profound moral complexity, individuals who had learned to employ morally questionable means in service of unquestionably moral ends, and who had found ways to do so without losing their essential humanity. The key to understanding these exceptional individuals lay in recognizing that they had developed what Machiavelli came to think of as virtuous vice, the ability to employ harmful methods in ways that ultimately served beneficial purposes. This was not merely pragmatic flexibility or situational ethics, but a sophisticated form of moral reasoning that acknowledged the tragic structure of political reality while refusing to surrender to cynicism. Consider the case of Lorenzo the Magnificent, whose approach to power had mystified and impressed Machiavelli during his youth. Lorenzo understood that Florence's survival depended on maintaining a delicate balance among competing factions, both internal and external. He achieved this balance through methods that would have horrified a conventional moralist: strategic deceptions, carefully calculated betrayals, the selective use of violence, and the systematic manipulation of religious and political symbols for secular purposes. Yet Lorenzo's employment of these methods was guided by a clear moral framework that transcended immediate tactical considerations. Every deception served the larger purpose of maintaining peace among factions that would otherwise destroy each other. Every betrayal prevented larger betrayals that would have devastated innocent populations. Every calculated use of violence prevented chaotic outbursts of violence that would have been far more destructive. Lorenzo had learned to think not in terms of individual moral acts but in terms of moral systems and their long-term consequences. The psychological toll on Lorenzo was evident to those who knew him intimately. He aged rapidly during his years in power, his naturally exuberant personality increasingly shadowed by the weight of decisions that had no purely good outcomes. He suffered from what we might now recognize as a form of moral injury, the deep psychological wound that occurs when someone committed to goodness must repeatedly act in ways that violate their fundamental values, even when such actions serve higher purposes. Lorenzo's private letters reveal a man constantly engaged in moral self-examination, questioning whether his methods truly served their stated purposes or had become ends in themselves. He worried that his facility with deception might be corrupting his ability to recognize truth, that his comfort with manipulation might be undermining his capacity for genuine relationship, that his willingness to employ violence might be coarsening his natural compassion. These were not the concerns of a cynical power seeker but of a deeply moral person who had accepted the burden of moral complexity. Machiavelli realized that Lorenzo's internal struggle represented the highest form of virtue available to those who wielded significant power in a fallen world. The truly virtuous leader was not the one who avoided moral compromise, but the one who accepted moral compromise while maintaining constant vigilance against its corrupting effects. This vigilance required extraordinary psychological discipline, the ability to remain morally sensitive while engaging in morally questionable behavior, to preserve one's essential humanity while temporarily adopting inhuman methods. This insight led Machiavelli to a revolutionary understanding of the relationship between public and private virtue. Traditional moral thinking assumed that private virtue naturally translated into public virtue, that the good person would naturally become a good leader. Machiavelli's observations suggested the opposite, that public virtue, the kind of virtue required to protect and preserve good institutions and good laws, often demanded the temporary sacrifice of private virtue. The leader who truly served the common good might need to lie to prevent panics that would harm innocent people. He might need to break promises when circumstances changed in ways that made keeping them harmful to those the promises were meant to protect. He might need to appear weak when strength would provoke destructive confrontations, or appear strong when strength was the only thing that would deter aggression. These were not moral failures but moral necessities, the price paid by those who accepted ultimate responsibility for complex institutions in a complex world. The redemption of necessary evil lay not in denying its evil character but in understanding its role within a larger moral framework. The lie told to protect innocent life was still a lie, but it was a lie employed in service of truth's deeper purposes. The promise broken to prevent greater harms was still a broken promise, but it demonstrated a higher fidelity to the spirit that had motivated the original commitment. The violence employed to prevent greater violence was still violence, but it represented a form of mercy toward those who would have suffered more in its absence. This understanding required a fundamental shift in how virtue itself was conceptualized. Instead of thinking of virtue as a set of rules to be followed regardless of consequences, Machiavelli proposed thinking of virtue as a set of purposes to be achieved through whatever means proved necessary. The virtuous person was not the one who followed prescribed behaviors but the one who achieved virtuous outcomes, even when doing so required temporarily adopting non-virtuous methods. This shift had profound implications for how moral education should be conducted. Instead of teaching simple rules and expecting them to apply uniformly across all situations, moral education should focus on developing the judgment necessary to navigate complex moral terrain. Students of virtue needed to learn not just what was good but how good could be achieved in a world where evil possessed significant advantages, where noble intentions often produced ignoble results, and where the preservation of virtue sometimes required its temporary abandonment. The most sophisticated practitioners of this complex virtue developed what Machiavelli observed as a kind of moral double consciousness, the ability to simultaneously engage in morally questionable behavior while maintaining emotional and intellectual commitment to moral principle. They could lie while remaining fundamentally committed to truth, employ violence while maintaining deep compassion for human suffering, manipulate others while preserving genuine respect for human dignity. This double consciousness exacted its own psychological price. Those who mastered it often reported feeling isolated from both the purely virtuous, who could not understand the necessity of their compromises, and the purely cynical, who could not understand their continuing commitment to ultimate moral purposes. They lived in a kind of moral exile, understood fully by neither saints nor sinners, bearing alone the burden of moral complexity that others either could not or would not accept. Yet Machiavelli came to see this isolation not as a tragic consequence of moral sophistication but as its natural and, perhaps necessary result. The individual capable of redemptive evil had moved beyond conventional moral categories into a realm where moral action required constant creativity, constant judgment, and constant risk. Such a person could not be guided by simple rules or conventional wisdom but had to develop an internal moral compass sophisticated enough to navigate unprecedented situations and complex trade-offs. The final wisdom that Machiavelli extracted from his lifetime of observation was that the toll of being good, the psychological price paid by those committed to virtue in an imperfect world, was not a design flaw in the universe's moral structure but its most essential feature. This toll served as a kind of moral tuition, the price paid for the education necessary to wield virtue effectively in complex circumstances. Those who paid this toll fully, who accepted the burden of moral complexity without surrendering to either naivety or cynicism, became capable of a form of moral action unavailable to those who remained within conventional categories. They could preserve what was worth preserving while adapting to what demanded adaptation, maintain fidelity to ultimate purposes while demonstrating flexibility about immediate methods, serve the common good while accepting personal moral costs that others would find unbearable. In the end, Machiavelli's hidden wisdom pointed toward a vision of virtue that was simultaneously more demanding and more hopeful than conventional morality suggested. It was more demanding because it required not just good intentions but sophisticated understanding, not just moral purity but strategic thinking, not just individual righteousness but systemic responsibility. But it was also more hopeful because it suggested that virtue could survive and even flourish in hostile environments, that good could be preserved and extended even in circumstances that seemed to favor evil, and that the moral development of exceptional individuals could create possibilities for moral progress that would otherwise remain foreclosed. The astonishing toll of being good was not evidence that goodness was futile but proof that it was so valuable that reality itself extracted a price for its preservation. Those willing to pay that price, to accept moral complexity, to embrace necessary contradictions, to bear psychological burdens that others avoided, became the guardians of civilization's highest possibilities. They paid the toll not for their own sake but for the sake of all those who would inherit the world their choices had helped to shape. In his final years, as Machiavelli contemplated the young men who would take his place in the endless struggle between virtue and necessity, he understood that his greatest contribution had been not to resolve this struggle but to illuminate its true nature. He had shown that the choice was not between virtue and effectiveness but between simple virtue and complex virtue, not between morality and realism but between naive morality and sophisticated morality. The toll would always be exacted, but those who understood its purpose could pay it without losing their souls, could employ necessary evil without becoming evil themselves, could serve the highest good through methods that conventional wisdom would condemn. This was Machiavelli's hidden wisdom, that virtue's toll was also virtue's triumph, that moral complexity was the price of moral sophistication, and that those willing to bear the full burden of goodness in an imperfect world were not moral failures but moral pioneers, exploring territories of ethical possibility that simpler souls could neither imagine nor inhabit. They were the true heroes of the human story not because they were pure, but because they were willing to become impure in service of purity's ultimate purposes.